Hi, everyone. We're so glad that you can join us today for the webinar. We're going to cover some quick case study information, and then Ron's going to go over creating and configuring a data container task and what happens when a data container task is initialized, and then posting data to a data container task. And then we'll be able to go over some questions at the end. So just go ahead and type them in the chat, and we'll let Ron know what the questions are. And then now we'll go over some case studies. If you have been successful with Integrify, we want to know about it. So you can pick a process that you've built and tell us what problem you've solved, how you built the process, and how the process helped. And then send it to Tony or Tom Martin. And then we'll share it in a tips email. And then you get to get some cool gear like this Integrify Eddie Bauer backpack. So if you're interested in that, just send us over the information. Doesn't need to be too advanced. And then, yeah, we can get some case studies from you. So now I'm going to let Ron take over to go over some data container information.
Okay. Thanks, Tony and Danelle. Um, Hi, everybody. So what we're going to look at today is our data container task. The data container task can be added to a process, and what it essentially does is it creates an API, a REST API endpoint that's specific to a request that you can use to post data from an external data source into that request that can then be mapped into a form or be used elsewise within the process. So I'm going to go through the steps on adding the data container to a process and how to configure it, and then also how you post data to it. If any of you were in training for using the API, you use the API to post data into the data container. So you should be, you'll be somewhat familiar with what using the API looks like. Um, but I'll step through that step by step on how to post the data. So let me share my screen here. Okay, so I've just started a process. I've just called it vendor invoice payment. So it's a blank process at this point. I haven't added anything to it. So I'm just going to add, to start with, just a form task here. So this would be like something like enter vendor invoice. And I'll configure it. We'll give it a recipient. And I've pre-created a form that I'm going to use. So let me just select that and then I'll review it so everybody knows what it looks like. It's called invoice payment. So we'll take a quick look at the form. So the form is intended for someone to fill in a vendor name, select an expense category, and attach an invoice file, like a PDF file or something like that, and submit the form to have it approved and paid. And the payment is done by an external accounting system. So what the process is going to allow is for that external accounting system, or sometimes an integration interface that's in between, allow that data from the accounting system to be posted back into Integrify to the specific request that the payment request came from. So when that happens, the data then can be mapped back on into the form and display a check number, a check date, and a check amount in Integrify. So we have this form, then I'll just put a milestone indicating that the vendor, this is a vendor payment requested. And now I'm going to add a data container task. So it's here on the left, data container. And we're going to call this receive payment data. So the configuration of the data container task itself is very, very simple. You just essentially create keys or fields that can receive the data. So um, Remember on the form, we had three pieces of information that we are going to be receiving from that external API call. So I'm going to add those here. So one is going to be the check number. So I'm going to call that check num for short. I try not to use spaces here. It makes it easier on the API side or on the application side that's posting to the API. If we use key values that don't have spaces. So I say key value because the data is JSON. So the API, the endpoint that's created as a REST API that will accept a JSON data post. So uh, in JSON, you have key value pairs. So these are the keys that I'm adding here. And then when the data is posted, it posts the key name that you create here, and then the value that is the data that's being sent. And then you have a check date and a check amount. So those are my three pieces of data that I'm going to allow to be posted back into my request. And then once that's received, I'm going to change the status of my request to invoice payment completed. And then we're going to route another form task and then include this data that we receive from the external post. Um, on this form. So here I'm going to use the same form. It could be a different form, but for some simplicity, I'm using the same form and I just included the three fields on this the same form. So the key part here to get the data onto the form is in the prefills. So I'm going to be using some specific mappings, plus we want to include what was filled in on the form on the first task. So I'll use latest matching value here as well. And then on the advanced settings, on the prefills. So these are the three pieces of data that's coming in from the data container or to the data container. So I'm going to map the data from the data container into these three fields. So check number, the received payment data is the data container task. And then it shows me the three key fields that I added. So I'm going to select the check number one. And then for check date, and check amount. Okay, so those are the three specific pre-fill settings direct from the data container into these three fields of this form task. Okay, so setting up the data container itself is really simple. You're just creating fields, giving it field names and those field names have to be communicated. So you might have an internal developer um, that's creating an interface between an accounting system and Integrify, or you may have a system, SAP, CostPoint, whatever. Um, Maybe they have facilities that allow you to post data to an API, a REST API. So it would be configured in there. So um, they need to know a couple things on their side to be able to post to this. One is this task name. So they receive payment data. They need to know the task name in order to query the request to get the specific value to post to. And we'll be looking at that and what it looks like. And they need the key names that we created. So the three that we created here was the check num, check date, and check amount. So they need those. The other thing that needs to be known on the sending side is the request ID. So for every request that's created in Integrify, it's assigned an ID number plus what's called an instance squid, which is a unique identifier. So one of those needs to be passed to the accounting system along with the, the payment request in this case. So this process may in here have a DB push, or maybe it has a REST client. So the data that we're collecting here about the invoice is being posted to the accounting system. When we send that, we have to send the ID for the specific request. So it knows what request it's posting back to. Okay, so I'm going to run this request or run the process. Um, there's a form. I'm just going to fill in vendor name, select a category, attached invoice file. Um, this. Okay, so we're just collecting this information and we're going to post the invoice information. Okay, now you can see this is completed and it's initialized this data container task. So in the request detail, see we have a data container here that's started status. So that indicates that that data container is now waiting for data to be posted into this request. I'm going to switch over. There's actually an issue in the new version that we can't see the endpoint here. So I'm just going to show you what it should look like. Um, Same process in version 7. So a data container, when you expand it in the request detail, it shows us this data container endpoint. So this is a unique endpoint specific to this request and this data container. So the GUID that's here is unique. And that's what identifies how Integrify knows when the data comes in from the external source to be able to match it up to this request to post the data into this data container for this request. So we can see it here. Um, so when you're creating a process and testing this out, you can get the endpoint to post to here as opposed to going through the API steps to query the request to get the list of data, the list of endpoints that are available for the data container to post to. So now that we have this request waiting for data, I'm going to be switching over. So first, remember I said I needed to know the request ID. So I'm going to borrow this from the URL up here. This is our request instance squid. So I'm going to switch to sharing a different screen. Okay, so when you're obviously when you're developing to do the integration with Integrify and post to a data container, someone's going to be writing either configuring that or writing code to post back into the Integrify API to post the data. So you would typically use a utility like Postman or SoapUI that allows you to do API calls. It provides an interface to do the API calls. So this is Postman, so I'm going to use this for demonstration purposes. So this is something you'd use during development to work through the steps and make sure everything's working. Um, Once you've developed it, then whatever application you're using to post the data is what takes over and actually runs it. So I'm going to start by, let me just paste this instance it in here a second so I don't lose it. First thing an application would have to do to post data to Integrify is to get an authorization token. So we went through this, I believe. Well, we've done it in other trainings. So if you're posting from outside, you need to get an authorization token. So I'm just doing a GET request to our auth service um, to get an auth token. So I need to get that. And I'm authenticating with my own user ID here. So here's my auth token. And this you would do no matter if you're using data containers or anything else with the Integrify API. So next step is to get the endpoints. So first, I'm going to paste in my auth token in here to it's a bearer token into the authorization. So there's two steps from externally. Once you're authenticated, there's two steps to be able to post the data. So the first one is this endpoint. So this is I'm using plusservices.integrify.com as my Integrify instance. So the API call that we need to do is the slash task types data container endpoints. And what this does is it returns the endpoint. So the endpoint that I showed you in the request detail, um, obviously you don't want to have to look that up every time, and the application that's doing the integration isn't going to be able to view that. So it has to do an API call to get that endpoint that's unique to the request in that data container. So that's what this does, is it retrieves that endpoint for the data container in the request for us to post to. So the parameters to it, the first one is instance underscore SID. So this is the instance SID that I copied from my request that I just created. And then task name. So the task name receive payment data is the name of my data container task that I created in the process. So, and this is a GET type API call because all of the information is included in the URL here. We're not posting anything in the body of the request. So I'm going to send that. And then you can see here it returns an array of endpoints. So potentially you could have multiple endpoints depending on the process. And it would be unusual, I would say, for using a data container to have more than one endpoint return. So you see here we have endpoints and we have, this is the endpoint for for the data container in that request. So now we can take this, and this matches what was in what I showed you um, in the request detail. So I'm going to take this now and create another request. So again, it's the same base URL and post the endpoint in. So the unique part of this is this GUID that's here. It starts with FA05. That's what's unique between the endpoints. And now here, this is a post because we're posting data. So you can see here, I've already created this body, so I didn't have to spend the time to do it. But we have a check number, check date value, and a check amount. Okay, so these are the three. This is where it has to match the field keys that we set up on the data container: check num, check date, and check amount. So these are the key values, and then the value that's matches come after it. And the curly braces on each end is basically indicating that's a JSON object that we're passing in. Okay, so we're taking this data and posting it or sending it into Integrify, which will match it up to the data container on that request. So I'll send that. And this one, I need to update my token. So I'm going to grab it from here. Update the token and send it again. And then as long as it successfully matched up, found that endpoint and posted the data, it'll return um, an array of JSON objects indicating the value that was set for each one. But now that data has been posted into that request um, that I that I created. So I'm going to switch back now so we can see that. So this is my request. I'm going to refresh it. See, now my data container is marked complete. If I expand it, it shows us the data that was posted to the endpoint, and it's progressed on to the review payment. So that's this review payment task. If I open it, we can see on the form, it's mapped it into the three fields on the form. Okay, so that's basically all there is for using it from an external API to post data into Integrify onto a specific request. I'm going to show you one other example of how we might use it, or we have used it, which internally within a process. So if you were at the advanced training in Nashville, you would have seen this already. But I'm going to switch to a process. This is a process that's used to update a database table. It provides an interface, like an administrative type interface, to allow the updating of a custom table within the Integrify database. So I'll just quickly just show you what the form looks like. This is updating additional user attributes. So it allows the user to select one of the Integrify users and then select an attribute for that user and then update the value. So there's no workflow. So it's just providing a user interface here um, to update the table. When they can't submit it, the data doesn't flow through a process at all. But the entire process, the way it's defined, um, is basically taking a data container task here and then mapping that into a database call to do the update in the database table. So this data container, we're posting the data from the form using JavaScript on the form, posting directly into this data container from the form. And then once the data is posted into the data container, it transitions to one of the database push tasks to do the database update. And then it loops back around. Once that's completed, it loops back, reinitializes the data container. So it sits and waits for another operation. So the user can form multiple database updates um, from that form. So I'm going to create a request here. And I'll just select a user, an attribute, and click save. You can see the attribute appears here. If we go and look at the request detail, you can see this data container. Actually, let's see. Yeah, we can see it from here. The flow view, you can see that it completed one data container. Might have to switch to version 7. This is, well, it's here. I know it did the update. Let me make sure. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So it posted my insert. This was a new attribute for this user. It posted the data to the insert DB push task, and this is reading it back out, showing the attribute. So how that happens is in the form. So in this form, there's JavaScript that does the API, the REST API call. So for each one of these buttons, save and delete, those are tied to function calls that either post an insert or an update or a delete. So in the JavaScript of the form, and I won't go through all of it, but I'll show you the specific part that does the REST API. It's the save data function. So down here, you can see that we're doing basically what I walked through using Postman. So when what I didn't explain on the process, when you start a request, it initializes the form task for the user. So the user interface is initialized. The data container is initialized at the same time. So as soon as the request is started, the data container initializes. So when the user clicks save or delete, it runs this code. And so here are the API calls. Here's the task types data container endpoints, mapping in the SID, which is the same. It's the same request SID. So we can map the SID from the current request in here, and with this change data data container. So it's a GET request, just like it was in Postman. And then the data that comes back are the endpoints. So we take the endpoint and perform a post request here. And that data container has two fields or keys in it. One is SQL, and the other one is operation. So we're literally posting either the update, insert, or delete SQL into the data container, and then an operation matching update, insert, or delete. So that's posting data into the data container in the same request to perform the database function that the user is asking or requesting. Okay, so you can see here, once we do start, it's initializing this form task and the data container. So once this is initialized, we're posting data from the form using the JavaScript into this data container, which transitions it to a DB push, it loops around, reinitializes. So every time it loops here in this reinitializes, the endpoint changes. So the unique part that's unique to this request, every time this initializes, that changes. So that's why we have to, on the form, we have to do that endpoint API call to get the current endpoint because it'll change each time you post data to it and reinitializes. Okay, so that's pretty much it. It's very powerful task, but it's also very simple to configure. the a little bit more challenging part of it is using the API and understanding the API to do it. But if you're familiar with APIs and JSON, then that's pretty much relatively easy to grasp and to start using it. Okay, so Danielle or Tony, that's all I've got. Do we have any questions?
Um, let's see here. It looked like earlier there was a question when you were doing the form. Why did you define the date field as type string?
On the date container, um, yeah, let's see.
Yeah, I believe it was one of the first things that you did.
Yeah. So it's a data container task and it's receiving JSON data, um, which by default, it's basically all text. So when I create my keys on a data container, I have always just created them as string values. It's just easier, and I tend to run into fewer issues with type matching. Um, if you define these data types as something else, and then the data that comes in doesn't match that data type, it's going to cause the data container task to fail. So if you just receive everything as a string, then you can map it in, um, and better able to handle it um, within the process.
Perfect.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. It doesn't look like we have any other questions. I could wait a couple seconds, and if a question pops up, you guys can always reach out to Danielle or Tom. They'll be happy to follow up and answer your guys' question. Um, but if it doesn't look like anyone's typing or anything like that, I guess we could go ahead and wrap up. Again, I'll be sending you guys an email within the next 24 hours with a recording. And be sure to join us on October 19th. We'll have our next webinar, pre-fill priorities and auto-completing forms. So thanks again. I appreciate you guys joining us today.
Yeah, thanks everybody.